Hi, I'm Professor Corinne Bendersky. I'm a professor of management and organization at the UCLA Anderson School. I'm going to be talking to you about strategic decision making. Let's start with an introduction to decision biases and heuristics. We often think that when we make decisions, we're very rational. We follow the prescriptive advice of considering all of our alternatives and comparing their probable outcomes. We use objective standards and facts to evaluate and choose the alternatives, and we evaluate all of the alternatives simultaneously and choose the one with the highest payoff. People who study how people actually make decisions find a very different process. In reality, we often make decisions with limited information processing capability, and that makes us consider a small set of alternatives. We have implicit favorites and preferences, and we process facts in biased ways. And rather than considering all of the alternatives simultaneously, we often evaluate them sequentially and choose the first one that's good enough, not necessarily the optimal one. I'm going to define biases and heuristics because together these lead to those kinds of irrational decision processes. Biases are ingrained patterns of thinking, and heuristics are cognitive shortcuts. There are some pros to these patterns of thinking and cognitive shortcuts. They can be very adaptive and functional by helping simplify a complex social world. Most times, using these heuristic devices allows us to make decisions that are good enough in a very short amount of time. However, there are some cons if we over-apply them. If we rely too heavily on biases and heuristics, we can make decision-making errors. I'm going to be talking about some specific decision biases that we see in many organizational contexts. The first is called the confirmation bias, then framing effects, and finally the availability bias. The confirmation bias is our tendency to search for or interpret information that confirms our preconceptions. Most of the time when we're making a decision, we have some favorite. We have some belief about which of the options is likely to be the best. That preference focuses our search for an interpretation of evidence in biased ways. We really like information and evidence that supports our beliefs and expectations, and we tend to discount, ignore, or even not even look for information that does not support those beliefs. Let me give you an example. For a long time, there was a debate in the United States about whether or not smoking really caused lung cancer. The smoking industry presented the following data. They said, look, for every 100,000 smokers in the U.S., only 56 are diagnosed with lung cancer each year. This doesn't look so bad. Smoking, only 0.56% of smokers get lung cancer. Well, the problem is these data are biased. They are only presenting half of the story. In order to really understand the relationship between smoking and lung cancer, we need to also look at the lung cancer rates among people who do not smoke. And when we do that, we see a very different story. For every 100,000 non-smokers, only 8 are diagnosed with cancer in the U.S. each year. That means that of the 64 people diagnosed each year with lung cancer in the U.S., only 8 of them are non-smokers. In other words, 87% of those diagnosed with lung cancer each year are smokers. When you look at the full complement of data, a very different picture is drawn about the relationship between smoking and lung cancer. Now let's talk about framing effects. Start with an example. Imagine you're looking at the last quarter's numbers and you realize it's bad, it's still going down, and you're really in trouble. You ask your 12 employees to make some recommendations about how to turn things around, and you pick out 4 that you're going to consider more deeply. Now read along with me and take some time to decide which you would choose as the best option. First one is this would save 8 jobs and you're sure it would work. The second one has a 2/3 chance of saving everyone's job, but if it doesn't work, the whole company could close. The third one would cost 4 people their jobs, though it would work. And the fourth one has a 1/3 chance of resulting in the whole company closing, but if it works, everyone's job could be retained. Take a second to read through these carefully on your own. What did you notice? If you look carefully, you'll see that the outcomes of each of these options is exactly the same. And yet, psychologists and economists have found that when people choose between 2 of these options, say A and B, they overwhelmingly prefer this first one, in which 8 jobs would be saved. However, if they choose between options C and D, they would overwhelmingly choose this last one, where there's a third of a chance resulting in the company's closing, but if it works, everyone's job could be retained. So what does this mean? The insight from this research was really powerful because it helped us understand that the way that we define a problem affects the solutions that seem acceptable. In particular, whether we think about a problem in terms of gains to be realized or losses to be avoided changes our tolerance for risk. When we're considering losses, we prefer to take risky outcomes to avoid those losses. We're much more risk tolerant. But when we consider gains, we prefer to play it safe and are much more risk averse. Now I'm going to talk about the availability bias. And I'm going to show you some examples of animals, and I want you to decide which of these animals on average kills the most people in the United States each year. You ready? Do you think sharks kill the most people, cows kill the most people, or dogs kill the most people? What do you think? What's your first gut answer? Well, you might be surprised to learn that dogs kill 30 to 35 people a year in the US, cows kill 22, sharks kill less than 1. Most of us, however, believe and expect that sharks are much more deadly than cows or dogs. Why is this? Well, this is because of the availability bias. The availability bias says that an emotional, vivid, and easily imagined event will be more available in memory. That means it's going to be easier for us to imagine. We're going to think that those events are more common, more probable, more important than other events that are less available. They're less vivid, maybe more boring and bland. In reality, cows kill more people than sharks. Yet because it's hard to imagine an aggressive cow, we tend to focus and overestimate the risks of being killed by a shark relative to a cow. What this means is that without a systematic method to aggregate data, we may reward the wrong kinds of people for their effort in our company. We may be more inclined to reward someone who had one spectacularly good performance outcome despite a history of really mediocre performance, compared to someone who is a consistently high performer and hard worker, who over time probably performs better. Now I'm going to tell you a story that illustrates how all of these biases come together. And I'm going to use an example from NASA that involved actual rocket scientists to tell you that vulnerabilities to these kinds of biased decision-making processes have nothing to do with intelligence. This is the story of the tragic 1986 Space Shuttle Challenger disaster. Now, this was a really high-profile space shuttle launch because for the first time, NASA was launching a teacher into space. And this was supposed to be the beginning of a new era of space travel being accessible to common people. There was a huge emphasis, a huge amount of enthusiasm and press, and many school children were brought to their school libraries and other places to watch the launch live. Tragically, 73 seconds after launch, a booster rocket failed and the entire shuttle exploded, killing all of the people on board. Now, how did this happen? Post-action reviews revealed a great deal of biases in the decision processes that led to the launch. All of the media and attention to sending this teacher into space led to a great deal of confirmation bias. There was such a strong desire to launch that evidence that was brought to the meeting when they were deciding whether or not they should go that suggested there might be some problems with a component of the booster rockets under the specific conditions on the day of launch. That information was basically ignored. There were framing effects that led to put everyone in a risk-seeking frame of mind. NASA was very much focused on impending budget cuts. They did not want to lose money by failing to launch the shuttle. Morton Thiokol, which was the supplier of the component that failed, was afraid of losing the contract with NASA. That would make them go out of business. And because the key decision makers were focused so much on their losses instead of on potential gains, they were tolerated more risk than they otherwise might have. And finally, there was evidence of an availability bias. They had had 24 previously successful launches. Disaster was just unimaginable. Each of these things, their desire to launch, their loss frame, and their the accessibility of availability of success rather than failure led to an excessively risky decision to launch in spite of evidence suggesting that that could be problematic. So in sum, heuristics and biases contribute to non-rational decision making and decision errors. These biases I've talked about include confirmation, framing, and availability. What this means is that we tend to focus on data that supports our preconceived ideas and ignore data that doesn't. Framing affects our tolerance of risk, whether we're thinking in terms of gains to be had or losses to be avoided. And we focus much more on emotional, vivid events than on mundane, bland, or abstract events, and we overestimate the probability of them happening. Now, all of this is particularly relevant in an entrepreneurial venture. People who are deciding to start a new business tend to think about all of the ways in which their business is likely to succeed, despite the statistics that 8 in 10 new business ventures fail in the first 18 months. Thus, it is critically important that entrepreneurs utilize strategic processes to avoid making the kinds of biases that might lead them to overly risky investments and to fail to cut their losses when it becomes clear that this isn't going to work out. In the next section, I'm going to introduce you to some processes that help correct for these biases.